Welcome to the Lean to the Left podcast, where we focus on the key social issues of our time and where we're determined to call out Donald Trump for his attack on our freedom. Trump and his unelected co-president, Elon Musk, are attacking Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act, and the impact on millions of Americans and the healthcare industry will be devastating. And of course, that's to say nothing about all the cuts that he's trying to make across the government. On top of that, there's his frontal attack on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's taking hold across the nation. Today, we have with us Dr. Gail C. Christopher, the Executive Director of the National Collaborative for Health Equity, which was established in 2014 to promote health equity through action, leadership, inclusion, and collaboration. Dr. Christopher also is Senior Scholar at the Center for Advancement of Being at George Mason University and former Senior Advisor and Vice President of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. She's the author of RX Racial Healing, which details the power of racism and the need for healing. And I'm very happy that Dr. Christopher is with us for the second time on our podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Christopher.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I invited you because I saw a statement that you made, that you published for the National Day of Racial Healing, which was ironically the day after Trump's inauguration. And so I wanted to follow up with you on that to start with, because Jimmy Carter was such a positive influence, and your statement about him I thought was just eloquent. So would you like to maybe talk about that just a little bit as we get started?
Thank you. I'm really happy to. When we initiated the annual National Day of Racial Healing, it would have been 8 years ago now. We were definitely wanting at that point to remind people that the legacy of Dr. King was really about ending racism. And more importantly, it was about generating that beloved community, imagining that we had put all this foolishness behind us and we were really optimizing the potential of this democracy. Tens of thousands of communities around the country, they celebrate this day every year, and they do it the day after we celebrate MLK Day. It was ironic because every 4 years, MLK tends to correspond with a presidential inauguration. Our organization, the National Collaborative for Health Equity, we at least issue a statement on this day.
Sure.
And it also came about the same time we commemorated the passing of our former president, Jimmy Carter. And I was just so struck by his values and that were embodied in the life that he led, but more importantly, I think in his presidency. I read through many of his writings and his presidential biography, et cetera, and I realized there were 5 key factors that he stood for throughout his life, even though he was the son of the South in the purest sense, right? His ancestry included plantation ownership, enslavement, tenant farming, but he managed to overcome all of that and really stand up for human rights and civil rights. He was committed to peace. When the hostages were being held in Iran, he termed those hostages precious lives, 52 precious lives, and he was determined to bring them home and to maintain peace. He recognized that health is a human right. It shouldn't just be a transaction, a commercial privilege, that it should actually be assured, healthcare and health. He brilliantly understood that we should all have access to shelter. How can you live in a diverse climate without access to housing or shelter, which of course has a tremendous impact on our economy? I love the fact that he could lead against the odds and the tremendous victory he was able to achieve around the rewriting and the ratification of the Panama Canal Treaty. That was a lesson in leadership right there. His standing up for energy and recognizing our challenges in terms of needing renewable energy sources. He actually installed solar panels on the White House. And
Yeah,
perhaps,
and
yeah.
somebody that I know of had them taken down, right?
This is true. This is true. We can go forward and then go backward.
My goodness, I
So
know.
any way you look at it, he lived an example of what it means to commit your life to justice, to fairness, and to human rights. And I thought we needed to lift up that.
Did a great job, and thank you so much for that. We're now in a situation where Trump has been in power now for a bit over a month, and he's taken a wrecking ball to our government. And much of that is going to affect the elderly and people who need health care, including people with limited means. And his attack on Medicaid is scary. So I wanted to get your thoughts about that, about overall the impact of that, and what, if anything, can be done to slow this down.
I would say that I'm very pleased to see mobilization
Mhm.
across the country. And back at that unprecedented moment in our nation's history, recent history, when George Floyd was murdered, and we had over 25 million people come out and stand up for justice. I think that the mobilization for justice and for fairness this time around is going to dwarf that.
Hmm.
And it's beginning to happen, right?
Hmm.
Let's face it, our democracy is a work in progress. It is far from perfect. The language that was used by the founders in order to create a more perfect union, and that was an acknowledgement of the fact that this is a process.
Hmm.
And so this moment, this amazing moment, which is the result of a confluence of activities, I think the main one is the landscape of our national media has shifted so much. And there is just so much bombardment, if you will, of the psyche with lies, with misinformation, disinformation, but emotionally laden and communicated with emotion. There's a deliberate manipulation of the human mind and a subsequent impact on people that is driving behaviors, right? Driving decisions that are not in our collective best interest. And I believe that we have to get real smart about how we're communicating, what we're communicating, how we're bringing people together and mobilizing for our collective best interests. I know that many of the cuts that are being proposed are going to have a disproportionate negative effect on what people call red states. I think we have to stop using that language, red and blue, because there's a lot of diversity within each one. That
Hmm.
said, though, I think that the impact that's going to happen economically, and ultimately that's the engine for our country, it's going to be disproportionately felt by communities that are low income. And if you do the demographic analysis, this is really going to hit the southern states. So I think there's some short-sightedness going on in terms of who's going to suffer.
When you say that the red states will feel a disproportionate impact of that's very ironic because, of course, it was those states that put Trump in the White House.
It is. I've heard snippets of interviews of people who did vote and are seeing what they are calling a betrayal now. There was an interview of people in the Arab American community in Michigan that I
Okay.
heard where once this statement was made about owning Gaza, the Gaza Strip and turning it
Right.
into the Riviera. They interviewed some of the Muslim and Islamic leaders in Michigan, and they were like, they were aghast. They just couldn't believe it, right? Uh, but also, I've heard Venezuelan immigrants who have work permit who are here legally, but
Hmm.
they recognize that they're being deported when they're saying we're being betrayed. They told us, particularly these are folks in Florida saying, but they told us we would be safe. We wouldn't be. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of buyer's remorse going on, and
Yeah, there is.
it's going to increase, I think.
I do too. When the impact of these tariffs is eventually felt and the price increases on consumers hit them when they go to the grocery store or when they go to buy a car, 25% tariff on a new car. Cars are already horribly expensive. So that's just incredible. How can he possibly believe that is going to be good for this country and good for the people that voted for him, for crying out?
There's a mixed narrative about that, and I don't know how long it will be salient, but there's this concept that these are negotiating tactics, right?
Yeah,
That
yeah,
in fact these things might not happen.
yeah,
I'd like to riff a little bit. I think that there's a lack of awareness of the harm that comes with uncertainty. Uh, and it doesn't, whether they happen or not, the threat of them does land in the psyche of decision makers in the markets, et cetera. So
absolutely.
whether they are tactics or promises, they do have an impact on behavior and subsequently on the economy. But these are the moments we're living in, and we have a decently large constituency for our work. And I'm finding that people are struggling with how do I cope? How do I get through this?
Yeah, yeah. What is it that I should ask you? How are these actions affecting the work and the future plans of the National Collaborative for Health Equity?
At this moment, we're staying the course. We don't, at this moment, rely on federal funding, and we're not experiencing some of the whiplash and
Right.
shock that some of our colleagues are.
Yeah.
So we're staying the course. Our work always focused on our interdependent humanity. People have their phrases, and those phrases are easy picking when we come to polarization and opposition. But we didn't really lean into those phrases like critical race theory or DEI. We've always been focused on our shared humanity and on fairness and justice. That's not going away. In fact, we may come out of this moment in time as a much more cohesive, much more developed, if you will, democracy. That's my hope.
Okay. I hope your hope is realized. I hope your hope is realized.
I love it. Okay.
That's quite a statement, isn't it?
It is,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That brings up this attack on DEI that is taking place, and it's not just in the government where he's ordered every opportunity that he's had. He's ordered any initiative that smells in any way of DEI to be done away with. Companies across the country are taking the clue. And I don't know whether it's that they're just saying, oh, this is a way we can get rid of this program that's costing us a bunch of money. We don't need it anymore. Trump says so. We have companies and I'll just say Target. I always thought that Target was a really good company with a good soul. And now they've done what they've done with respect to DEI. Their DEI program, they just killed it. So it's got an influence across the economy, whether anything's implemented really in the end nationally or not, right?
Yeah. I'm very proud of some of the major civil rights organizations like the NAACP. If you go to their website, they have a consumer's guide,
Okay.
and they're asking people to essentially not shop in stores that have done that, right? That
Yes,
have
yes,
reversed their stand.
yes.
And I think in our democracy, we have many ways of expressing our concerns, and we have many voices, if you will.
Mhm.
I'm excited about that, and some of the economic data that came out this week speaks to a reduction in consumer activity. We do, we have more checks and balances than just our court system, right? Our consumer-based economy is another potential check and balance. So again, I am hopeful that we're going to come out of, and even if people don't deliberately use that 19 action, we used to call it boycotting, right?
Yeah,
Even if they don't do that, if you fire tens of thousands of people who had really middle income jobs and
yeah,
employment, they
right.
simply aren't going to have the money to shop.
That's right.
And they're really going to be hurting. And
That's
that's
right.
going to have ripple effects. And specifically in regions where the federal government is the most active, places like Kansas City, right? Places like Virginia. The estimate is that over $100 billion annually in contracts go into the state of Virginia. If you just suddenly stop, that's going to devastate that local economy. So there are many interrelated, integrated, intersectional dynamics here that will show up. They should have been thoughtfully considered ahead of time, but that's not the modus operandi right now.
Yeah. So what do you see of the impact of all of this on the elderly?
Of course, I share your concerns that the most vulnerable will suffer the most.
Yeah.
And that's true domestically, and it is horrifically true internationally. The hallmark of our democracy since World War II really has been, as was embodied in the values of President Jimmy Carter, the hallmark has been human rights, right? It has been standing up for freedom and for democracy. We have done more to fight the most threatening pandemics of our lifetimes, things like HIV/AIDS, other pandemics like Ebola in developing countries. Congress put mechanisms in place to do that. And those have been slashed, right? And so people are suffering as a result of that. People will suffer here as a result of the projected cuts in the funding of our social infrastructure. And we shall see how we come together as communities to embrace and protect one another. But I guess my biggest concern or lament is that none of this is necessary. It's just totally unnecessary.
Yeah, and so the motive is what do you think? Is the motive I've had some guests on here who suggest that Trump is just trying to set things up so he has a way to rake in a bunch more money, and including even his mass deportations. I had a guest on that suggested that they would try to use that Trump would try to use that to extract bribes from people not to be deported or from employers not to deport their employees. What do you think about that kind of stuff?
I am not directly involved. I have never met any of these individuals, and so I would be wrong if I tried to interpret their motivations.
Okay,
I can only interpret their actions and the
right.
effects that their actions are having. Right?
Okay.
And I do believe that we're living in an ethos, if you will, in an environment now that is normalizing cruelty. And it is clear that the capacity to feel the pain of the perceived other, or even compassion for the perceived other, it's clear that is lacking in the decision-making apparatus.
Yeah.
Now, why that is, you could take a psychological perspective, you could take a biological perspective, you could take a religious perspective, right?
Hmm.
Throughout our history, at least in the second half of the 20th century and up to now in the 21st century, we've recognized that as a species, as a human species, we need the capacity for empathy. We need to demonstrate the capacity for compassion and understanding. And we've been working toward that with our United Nations, with our commitment to human rights through the Office of International Development. We've been trying to grow along that continuum.
Right.
And so this is a bump in that road. It's a real big speed bump. It's really
Huge, for
slowing us
sure.
down. But I have faith, honestly, that we're going to come through this and we're going to come through it better than we were going in.
Yeah, I saw an interview that you did with Salon in which you said that despite the election of Trump, you were feeling hopeful. Now, that was back in January, but you're still saying that you feel that way, right?
I do. We do an annual poll at our organization. We're going to do it again this spring, and we call it the Heart of America survey. And this will be our third annual. And it's a nationally represented sample. We use one of the best polling firms. And one of the things that comes through in that is that the majority, I'm talking 80%, of the people who respond, whether they're Republican or Democrat, whether they're old or young,
Hmm.
uh, they want our country to grapple with and reconcile our history. They want diversity in the workplace. They want us to learn to cross our differences and move forward in a peaceful way. So, this strident dynamic that we're seeing today, that's coming from the highest offices in the land, it is not typical. It is atypical. It is not a reflection of the majority. Now, people talk about the election outcomes, but let us not kid ourselves. Our election infrastructure is flawed. The electoral college dynamic needs to be replaced with a much more democratic approach to elections.
Certainly.
And even if
Certainly.
we look at the margin of victory within the popular vote, it was there for the first time in a long time for the winning presidential candidate. But that said, our polling is real clear, and I think it has to do with what kind of questions you ask as well. If you
Right.
ask
Right.
polarizing questions, you're going to get polarizing answers,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But if you
Right.
ask questions that are designed to speak to our better angels, right, you're going to get answers that reflect our higher selves. And
Yeah.
so all of that is to say it fuels my optimism. And I've lived long enough to have seen us, so have you, to have seen the pendulum swing. And so I believe it's going to, and I think what we believe and our consciousness, I think that's an active creative force. And so I'm not going to get on that train of fear and negativity. I've studied a lot of our nation's history.
Hmm.
And whether it was enslavement or the annihilation of the indigenous people, or for that matter, the Jim Crow era that lasted almost 100 years,
Yeah.
the model that undergirded all of that was simply make them stand in fear. And so if we allow fear to be our dominant emotion, to be the signature of our times, we're paralyzed. We can't
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah. What can people do? You feel so helpless. You see all this stuff going on. The Democrats don't have a majority in either the House or the Senate. Of course, not the White House. And Trump has stacked the Supreme Court with conservatives. So are we helpless? Is there anything that people could do?
You know, I'm a survivor of many challenges over the years. And one thing I refuse to ever define myself as
Hmm.
is helpless or victim.
Okay.
And I think if you talk with people with disabilities, if you talk with women who've survived domestic violence, if you talk with anybody that has succeeded against the odds, they will tell you that they will not have a mindset of failure. They will not have a mindset of helplessness or victimization. So I think the mindset is our most powerful tool as we come up with successful strategies
Hmm.
to for driving our actions, right?
Hmm.
There are at least 80 lawsuits in play right now, and communities are at work around the country to help the immigrants to be protected. There is litigation going on, and organizing groups they are working on the litigation in New York City. The governor of New York State, they knew what was coming down the pipe, and so they already had they had that litigation filed the same day. And I think we have to be prepared to use the actions that are available to us within our existing structure. But we also have to I'm writing a piece right now that is talking about the relationship between distress and poor health outcomes. So
Okay.
even for our own health and being, we can't let ourselves wake up every morning and feel helpless. These
Hmm.
actions are designed to make us feel that way. And we just have to know that that's not the truth. So anyway,
So that's probably one of the strategies behind this barrage of executive actions that Trump has taken to try to just overwhelm the opposition and make the opposition us feel like there's nothing we can do, that we just have to write it out. That's the strategy, right? And
yeah, we're
and
being, yeah, yeah,
well,
we're being gobsmacked. That's for sure.
yeah, that's for sure. And you know what? I saw a piece the other day where the author suggested that Trump crowd has really planned to have all these cases go to court, hoping that they will lose so they can appeal and eventually get these things before the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Do you think that's really a strategy, or is that just happenstance?
Oh, no, I think it's a definite strategy, at least with something as central as birthright citizenship. And I tend to focus not on an individual, but on this community that has been, that wrote Project 2025.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
that, truthfully, that's writing all the executive orders, right? This is definitely a strategy.
Yeah.
Make no mistake about it. There is nothing accidental about any of this.
Okay.
Uh, and that's my perception, right? And it is a, what can we say, a cadre, if you will, of folks who have a belief system that is contrary to our pluralistic democracy. There is a belief system at play here that thinks that authoritarianism is superior to a pluralistic democracy. And these are the forces at play here. And yep, this happens periodically in the evolution of a democracy, but I am convinced, based on the data that I've seen, that
Uh-huh.
it's not the majority.
Oh, I don't think it's a majority either, but the people in power have the power right now.
Well, there are different definitions of power. And over my lifetime, particularly in holistic health and being and motivational work with
Hmm.
communities that have been impoverished or marginalized, I
Hmm.
always remind people you are connected to the same source of power ultimately that anybody else is.
Yeah.
And don't give up your power. You have power. That power is tied to your mindset and to your determination and to the actions that you are willing to take. So that's true. Our elected officials now may have views and are taking actions that are contrary to what the majority believe in,
Hmm.
but that doesn't mean that we are helpless or that we don't have power.
Okay. Now, I want you to tell us about your book, RX Racial Healing. But before you do, can you just give us a little bit more of a rundown of what the National Collaborative does? What's your daily work like? What is it that you created this organization for, and what do you do along the way to implement those objectives?
I appreciate the question. Thank you. And we have for many years, we even existed before 2014, but under a different name, right?
Hmm.
But so for more than 20 years, we've been working with local leaders, elected officials, community activists, teachers, physicians. We've been working with diverse local coalitions to tackle what we used to call health disparities. We now call them health inequities, right? But we have found that local people can solve problems when they come together and they have the strength of unity. They also have some sort of funding or support. So what we do at NCAG is we bring local people together so that they can identify and come up with solutions to the problems that they are experiencing. We really focus on what we call the social determinants of health. And that has to do with poverty, right? That has to do with quality, affordable housing. That has to do with environmental toxicity and environmental changes that make low-income communities more vulnerable. Has to do with funded education. Those are the social determinants. And so if you were to visit our website or visit us, you're going to see what we call communities of practice. You're going to see folks coming together exercising their agency to help solve their local problems. And then we lift up the lessons that we learn from that. Because there is often a big gap between federal policy and the reality of the local lived experience. So we try to bridge those gaps. And we think data is helpful. That's why, to digress for a moment, this scrubbing of data from the CDC website, data that we need to
Right,
track
right, right,
something like
right,
avian flu or the bird flu, this is really dangerous when it
right.
comes to our potential for continued progress, even as human beings, right?
Okay.
So
All right. Now let's talk a little bit about your book, RX Racial Healing. What brought you to do that book, and just give us a little bit of an overview of what you've done.
I'll start by saying I spent much of my early career as a clinician.
Okay.
And there's something about working with people, working with patients on a daily basis that helps you to shed the illusions of superficial differences, right? When you're in the health sciences, you recognize we have the same blood generally, you know what I'm saying? We have the same connective tissue.
Sure.
So for most of my lifetime, I have worked to help us not be blinded by the perceptions of difference. And in our society, most of those differences are embodied in this antiquated notion of racial hierarchy, this thing that carries over from the 16th, 17th century, where this notion that there was a taxonomy of the human family. And some people who happened to be white and male were at the top of that taxonomy, and red, brown, whatever. And then we got back down to the Africans that were placed by the creators of this false taxonomy, Linnaeus and others in the Enlightenment. They put Black people at the bottom, right? But that's just a fallacy. It's a carryover from the history, but it still lives. It lives in the minds of many people who are in elected office today, and they believe in this fallacy.
Yeah.
So the work of racial healing primarily is to give us experiences that get rid of that fallacy. And the social science research is very clear that the best way to overcome, I'll just say racism and the belief in racial hierarchy, is through authentic, meaningful interactions with people who are different. It's through sharing stories of our human experience, stories in response to basic human motivation and human needs. And I developed a methodology for doing that. It took me decades to refine it. It started back in the 70s with a program called Americans All. And then at the Kellogg Foundation, we were able to apply it to what was called America Healing. And then ultimately to a national effort we call Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. But the protocol for bringing people together and creating a safe space, right? Curating authentic opportunities for sharing across our perceived differences in positive ways. That's what's embodied. That's what I mean by prescription. It's showing people how to do this. And that on the National Day of Racial Healing, that's what communities were doing all across this country, coming together to affirm our shared humanity.
Okay. And people can find RX Racial Healing on Amazon and where else?
Actually, it's not on Amazon.
Oh,
I
okay.
partnered with the American Association of Colleges and Universities,
Okay.
AACU, and we have over 70 college campuses that are using this approach. And it is the publishing arm of that association that publishes the book,
Oh, I
because
see.
all of the
Okay.
proceeds from the sale of the book, they go to support the work
Okay.
on college campuses and within communities. So people can go to aacu.org and
Okay.
the publications department there, and they can get the book there. They can get it electronically and in hard copy.
Excellent. Okay. Dr. Christopher, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I just want people to not give up hope and to
Okay.
recognize that we will get through this, but we'll get through it together.
All right. Thank you so much. Hey guys, I'm Bob Gatty, founder and host of Lean to the Left. I'm excited to share our new book, Hijack Nation, Donald Trump's Attack on America's Greatness, co-authored with political analyst and professor C.J. Waldron. In Hijack Nation, we delve into the unfolding story of America's political landscape through a series of essays from leantotheleft.net. We explore how Donald Trump's presidency has transformed American politics, challenging our values and institutions. Hijack Nation isn't just a book, it's a call to action. It invites you to reflect on what it means to be American in a divided political landscape. Together we can reclaim our nation's greatness. So get your copy of Hijack Nation today. Visit leantotheleft.net and click on the Books tab to learn more and to order.